So you think that the Western civilization hangs in the balance?
I do, yeah, or at least the Western civilization as we have known it.
Hello and welcome. You are watching Lockdown TV from unheard.com. So critical race theory. This is something that suddenly cropped up in one of President Trump's speeches last week, and it's not something that many people know much about. But here joining us from Knoxville, Tennessee, is the author and commentator James A. Lindsay. Hi, James.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. So can I just ask straight away, the speech, was it last week that President Trump gave a whole kind of quite a detailed discussion of critical race theory and what that meant? Did you help with that speech in any way?
I did not help directly with the speech, but I sort of get the impression that somebody who did help with the speech has probably been reading things I've been writing.
Right, yeah, because your new book, Cynical Theories, is pretty much a step-by-step guide to what critical race theory and its kind of sister ideologies actually mean and where they came from. And I really would like to get into that. But first, since we mentioned the Trump speech, let's just talk about that for a sec. How do you feel that President Trump being sort of directly involved in this discussion will affect it?
It's complicated because, obviously everything that Trump talks about gets polarized, and people, a lot of people just reflexively become for anything he's against and become against anything that he's for, which complicates the discussion a bit. I think it's necessary. I think it's actually a good step that's taken place because the need to have the conversation on that level where it's a now national talking point that everybody's wanting to look into and learn more about, I think is necessary. I think that this is an ideology that requires sunlight. It requires looking at my position on critical race theory and these sister ideologies, though you'll find that I'm quite critical of them, has always been that if people want to take them up, that's their business, but they should do so clear-eyed, understanding what they're taking up. And so this at least forces people to take a look at it, or at least leads them to be very likely to take a closer look at it and to have that debate in a public way that wasn't happening.
Right.
That also, because critical race theory is an ideology that's based wholly on power, it now meets power with power. So subversive power is now being met with a direct block to it. I've been comparing his executive order and the speech in which he announced it a bit to like taking the beach at D-Day and establishing a front where something is finally pushing back on an ideology that's just been able to spread unchecked by any set of power or argument or reason or logic or anything. So I think it's actually a good step. Of course, the polarization is dangerous. It may backfire, and there's always a concern, with the way that he worded things about patriotic education and so on. I think if you have to err one way or the other in a country, you should err toward patriotic education, but it should only be an error. It shouldn't be something that's deliberate. So there's wariness on all sides.
Suddenly, for that phrase to appear in the president's speech in the middle of a campaign, it gives a face to the enemy in some sense. So people who kind of felt instinctively uncomfortable with some of this, who might not want to call themselves against Black Lives Matter because that phrase is so kind of obvious that anyone with a good heart would want to be in favor of it. They may not like the phrase woke either because that's overused and sounds a bit silly, but kind of critical race theory almost sounds a bit sinister, doesn't it? So you can see how it might be potentially quite an effective part of a political campaign.
Well, it's true. And there's something very odd that's been happening. I mean, there are, of course, charitable explanations for everything. So maybe it's not as odd as I want to think it is. But something very odd that's been happening in the media around this entire turn of events with the president is that very, very rarely will you find it called critical race theory in the headline or the article that's written complaining about Trump's decisions or about the executive order or the memos that have gone out related to all of it. Instead, you hear them call it diversity training or racial sensitivity training or anti-racism training, but they very rarely will actually call it by its name, critical race theory. And partly it could be that they don't want to use technical jargon. That's a fair enough possibility. But on the other hand, I contend, again, that anybody who actually stops to take a look and actually reads what critical race theory is saying, rather than what its kind of apologists frame it out to be in this very kind of nice way, if you just go read this actual textbook, it's kind of shocking. You know, they openly say that they're against liberalism, that they believe that liberalism and the Civil Rights Act were decisions that made matters worse for especially black people, but racial minorities across the board, not things that led to racial equality before the law and the least amount of racism that we've ever had. So if people actually go to read critical race theory for themselves, read this book, for example, the critical race theory introduction, they find that there's a lot of alarming ideas in there that they immediately understand to be not what it's being packaged up to be.
Okay, so before we go any further, I think it's only fair to our audience to define what we're actually talking about. So I have next to me what President Donald Trump defined critical race theory as in his speech, which is, and I quote, "a Marxist doctrine holding that America is a wicked and racist nation, that even young children are complicit in oppression, and that our entire society must be radically transformed." How does that sound as a definition?
That's mostly correct. It's a bit high on the rhetoric. I would not say that it's explicitly a Marxist doctrine. It is more technically a neo-Marxist doctrine that has been infused with postmodernism, which makes it much more philosophically complicated, just to be completely upfront. And that's important because Marxism believes that reality exists and postmodernism does not. So there's a definite break there where with Marxism, you would be analyzing the material conditions of the world and connecting those to race and racism. Whereas with critical race theory, it's all about lived experience. It's, I experience racism, this hurts my feelings. It's all subjective. It all comes down to what somebody perceives. For example, the master bedroom thing that recently popped up, and now realty websites in the United States won't name houses as having a master bed or a master bath, because people perceived that the word master might be connected to slavery,
right?
Although that's not true. It turns out that the phrase first arose, I think, in 1926 in a Sears catalog. So it had nothing to do with slavery, but somebody might perceive that. So their lived experience is still of trauma to read those words. And so that has to be deferred to whether it's true or not. You see this with the police shooting statistics in the United States that are driving this from Black Lives Matter as well.
Right.
It doesn't matter how many unarmed black people are actually being shot by police. What matters is that black people feel like they're being hunted, as it's phrased, by police. And that lived experience, which is highly interpretive, is the thing that leads. So it's not quite Marxism. So the rest is correct, though.
So is it fair then to say that you know, people who are keen not to be in any way racist would, you know, be probably quite happy for there to be investigations into real racism, such as it appears, and to make a great effort not to be racist? Am I right in understanding that where critical race theory goes the additional step is saying, because it inherits this kind of postmodern view of the world where any objective reality is suspect, that if anyone feels the victim of racism, they are?
Yes, that's definitely a key component to it. Another is that the first assumption of critical race theory, which makes a number of explicit assumptions that it lists, is that racism is the ordinary state of affairs in society, not something that came up accidentally or aberrantly. It is the default state. So the underlying assumption has been phrased by Robin DiAngelo is the question is no longer did racism take place, but how did racism manifest in that situation? So it assumes racism is present. That's what it calls systemic racism. And so critical race theory, in the simplest definition, would be to believe that racism is systemic, that it exists kind of always and everywhere, just beneath the surface, hiding itself. And the job of critical race theory is to pick at the veneer or the mask and find where it's hiding and make it more visible, to agitate for people to change the entire system where it's been tucked away. So it's very important to understand that critical race theory begins with an assumption that racism is present and relevant, although it hides itself very well. And the job of the critical race theorist is to find the hidden racism in everything. So when you say, yeah, people would want to go investigate real racism, Of course they would. But critical race theory assumes racism is literally in everything.
So
Literally
is
everything.
there an end point to this? I mean, what is the kind of dream society as imagined by these theorists? I mean, how can we actually be good in this way of
No.
thinking?
The dream society would be whatever results, which they would believe would be anti-racist. They don't believe that there's such a thing as not racist. So it would stamp out racism anywhere it manifests, where that society is achieved by giving critical race theorists all the power to do that. And so the dream society is that they establish themselves as the party, the capital P party that gets to decide. And you see this, for example, in Ibram Kendi's recommendation that the United States needs a constitutional amendment of anti-racism that establishes a fourth branch of our government, the anti-racist branch, that has kind of super veto power over everything that happens within the government based on whether or not its operatives, who would all be critical race theorists, decide that something was racist or anti-racist in orientation. And so you can see that this is very much. I don't want to call them, like nefarious communist plot kind of people that I don't think they realize. I honestly don't think the majority of critical race theorists realize they follow in the same error that many Marxists take, which is, oh, if we can just seize the means of production, then everything will work out. And there's kind of this blank spot about how it works out that gets filled by people like Mao and Stalin and hundreds of millions of dead people. It's very similar with this. There's no clear explanation for how, when they get all the power, racism just goes away. And so it turns out in practice to be something that continually empowers them. And that's what they continually call for, is to empower themselves in the ideology. But their vision is that this will, through, I guess, mysterious ways, lead to a anti-racist utopia where everybody has racism socialized out of them if they've had it put into them. And then the children particularly are raised according to those rules. And so they wouldn't have ever been socialized into a racist worldview. That's how they say it. All white people, for example, and white passing people and white adjacent people, and then the ever expanding list of people who are too close to whiteness have been socialized into a system of racism. You can find, again, Robin DiAngelo saying this explicitly. All white people have been socialized into a racist worldview, all of them. And their view is if you don't socialize people into racism, then nobody will be racist, kind of by magic.
So where this does start getting very political, and the reason it's not surprising that it's ended up in a speech by the president, is that it feeds directly into this kind of majority versus minority tussle that is happening in countries. It's not just the US, it's happening across Europe and across the world. There's almost a sense in which the normative majority kind of can only cede so much ground and sort of bend over backwards to not be overbearing and not be overprivileged or overstrong. And at some point, there's a kind of backlash. And this is why it's potentially dangerous as well, because it's one thing to have a backlash, which is through the electoral system and people voting in politicians who liberals might deem unsavory. But it could be worse than that. What do you think the kind of dangers are in that respect?
So you've kind of named both. One is that there is an explicit racial backlash. That's sort of the worst one. That's, depending on, it's difficult to say what form that would take in the modern world, but that's roughly a race war. That's bad. That's really bad. And nobody, I think, except for very few people on the fringes, wants that to wake up. But it keeps being agitated for by this zero-sum conflict theory based. There's your actual, when Trump said it's Marxist, that's what he really means, is that it's based in conflict theory, where you split the majority and minority and say that they're in conflict with one another for resources. And conflict theory always spawns conflict because it assumes conflict is the only way that things work. The less dangerous one is still very dangerous, which is the kind of thing that's happened many times historically, where a electoral backlash installs something like a dictator on the opposite side, which is, I don't think it's credible at this point with Trump, but there are enough warning signs around him. But for me, what's much more concerning is that a genuine dictator who's much more consistently principled than Donald Trump is could very easily arise in the vacuum and come after him and be elected rather enthusiastically. Somebody who's more savvy, who's less maybe obviously self-interested or whatever it happens to be, could fill that vacuum. And it has historically been the case that when you have agitations of this kind getting too strong, that electing a strong man who then undoes democratic norms in a completely different way is a real threat. So those are the two big threats that we face right now. And in both cases, the well-being of liberal democracies around the world are under tremendous threat. There is, of course, the third one, which is that the critical race theorists get power, which is going to be totalitarian. It's not even authoritarian. It actually wants to purge people's thoughts that are wrong.
So there's a kind of tipping point, isn't there? I mean, it feels in the US context, but also here in the UK, it is confusing because those groups within society who have always been strongest are not necessarily so obviously strongest anymore. And it's almost like these theories kind of haven't caught up yet. I mean, in the UK, for example, white, less educated males in the north of England are definitely down the bottom of the list in terms of most disadvantaged and a lot of those statistics. And yet these kind of theories would still put them in a privileged position. And it's that kind of disconnect, isn't it, that I think feeds people's anger and leads to a bit of this confusion.
That's correct. Yes, that's absolutely correct. The balance of power has shifted rather tremendously. When you say that the theories themselves haven't caught up, I think that if you are able and willing to read enough of them, you can see that there's a lot of what they said. Let me start this way. A lot of what they said would have made a lot more sense in 1955. And if we start going forward from there, maybe even 1965, if we start going forward from there, what you start to see is an increasing effort to make the theory still fit that paradigm, to argue that nothing has really changed since then. And it's getting more and more tendentious to do it, even while the power arises. I don't mean to be rude or uncomfortable with people, but the truth is that when you live in a white supremacist society, as they claim that we all do, the response to somebody telling you that you need to check your racial privilege is usually a racial epithet. It is not, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, what can I do? A tearful apology on television. When you actually live in a properly racist or white supremacist society, the response is definitely not bending over backwards. It is telling people to get in their place and shut up. And so that was the reality of 1950s America, for example. That was unambiguously the reality. In the Southeast, where I live, that was the reality, and culturally and socially at least, well after the Civil Rights Act passed. They couldn't discriminate legally in jobs, but man, did they ever still call people names and put them down. And we still know that that's happening. The problem is that if you project a certain worldview out hard enough, you can kind of manifest it. If you look, they call them self-fulfilling prophecies. If you say, oh, the world is this way, the world is this way, the world is this way, eventually people will start to believe it. And then people will decide, well, okay, this is the way the world is, and we're going to play to win. And that's where you start getting into this fear for a genuine, horrific backlash, especially because the absurdity becomes untenable. It's absolutely absurd to believe that we live in the world that they describe. And after a while, people just break. And that's the last thing that we should want. We should want a peaceful and logical and democratic and rational solution to these issues. And instead, it's pure provocation over and over and over again. And it's doing so by projecting into the world a view. So when you say that the theories haven't caught up, I say that they willfully haven't caught up, because that's where the power and their argument lies, is 50 or 70 years ago.
How do we be responsible actors in this conversation then? Because there'll be people watching this video who kind of agree with what you're saying and are kind of saying, yeah, go James, you express it so eloquently. And then there'll be people watching it who strongly disagree and might be thinking, this guy is stoking up dangerous sentiments, that he's sort of
Sure.
giving a kind of, a respectable academic face to the kind of darkest impulses in our society. That is the kind of critique that you will get.
Sure.
So what do you say back to those people? How can you make sure to be responsible and not fan the flames?
No, of course. So that's actually extremely important. So I'm glad you brought that up. We actually need to be remembering the liberal principles that have done such a good job in our Western societies of minimizing racism. For example, treating people as individuals, as Martin Luther King very famously put it, of course, we're going to judge not by the color of skin, but by the content of character. That value should remain. We should definitely be treating people as individuals. We should minimize the impact that stereotypes have on our assessment of somebody. Maybe you can't avoid having a stereotype or something like that pop into your head, but then you can still meet the individual and talk to them and form an authentic relationship and try to break that down and actually engage with the person individual to individual. Another thing that we can all be doing is asking for objective standards. What does the evidence say? Let's turn to the evidence. We can listen to feelings, we can acknowledge feelings, we can care about feelings, your lived experience. Fine, I understand that it's very important to you, it matters, but at the same time, let's ratchet that back and let's look at the evidence. A great example of that is the kind of prototypical hypochondriac who goes to the doctor swearing that they have cancer, and the doctor pokes around and says, actually, you have gas, and you're very uncomfortable because you have gas. And if you let the gas go, or we put you on some kind of an enzyme or whatever that lowers that, you won't feel like you have cancer anymore. So the feeling of panic when the person goes to the doctor, the hypochondriac goes to the doctor, is real, and it should be acknowledged. You shouldn't be made fun of, but reality still matters. The real diagnosis still matters. So we should be asking people and demanding, in fact, that we look for the most rigorous answers to these questions possible. We need empirical studies. We need to respect empirical studies. We need to clean up our universities where these studies are done, because as my work has shown and with my colleagues, they are pretty ideologically bent and corrupted right now. So we need to just continue to ask for objective standards. In the United States, we have this movement right now in education to get rid of standardized tests for college or graduate school or professional school admission. This is a terrible idea. You want to have more objective standards and fewer subjective standards, because subjective standards lead to disputes that can't be resolved. So what we want to do is we want to defer to procedure, to law, to all of the things that have made our democratic societies work for the last couple hundred years, and to understand what those principles are, why those principles work, and then to put value in those. That would include, of course, equality before the law. And as many people have forgotten, we talked about the shift of power, many people have forgotten that the whole point of these systems was to protect the minority from the majority. So, yeah, historically speaking, freedom of speech, for example, has been a principle that protects the minority's ability to speak out against injustices perpetrated by the majority. So freedom of speech is something that we want to defer to. Rule of law, equal treatment before the law. When you look at these kind of horrific Jim Crow court cases that came up from the United States, and from before the Civil Rights Act was passed and before Jim Crow was thrown down, you just see these horrific miscarriages of justice. Like when you read To Kill a Mockingbird, you see these horrific situations with miscarriages of justice. Having a impartial system of law that doesn't take racial identity into account helps minorities more than majorities. So as long as the numbers are the way that they are, whoever the minority is, it doesn't actually matter how the numbers are, should always want to defer to liberal principles. And if we look, say, for example, at John Rawls's, veil of ignorance, how would you order society if you didn't know who you were going to be entering into it? You can clearly see that no matter how power shifts one way or another, that we want to uphold these principles of objective standards for qualification or admission or access, to, of course, listening better than maybe we have in the past, but still deferring to the evidence at the end of the day, doing a rigorous and careful investigation instead of hasty, quick decisions based on people's immediate reactions or feelings, Every one of us has been badly misled by a video online, at least I bet in the last week, not to mention, the last year. Those immediate outraged reactions are misleading, not leading to truth. So we should stick with these principles of rule of law, proper investigation, scientific and rational inquiry, not being hasty, holding objective standards wherever possible.
Does that mean
even money?
Does that mean a kind of colorblind, background blind approach across the board? I mean, would you be against any forms of positive discrimination, for university admissions or for, staff in public bodies or anything?
That's a very complicated question to say any. The answer is no. I would not be against any use. So my view on equity, which is what this boils down to, formerly known as affirmative action in the United States, is actually pretty nuanced. I believe that there is an argument to be made for equity anywhere that genuine discrimination can be identified by rigorous methods. And people, I think, genuinely tend to accept that. If we were to show that there were genuine discrimination leading to, or genuine impediments that are unfair impediments that are leading to disparate outcomes, people are often pretty open to at least closing some of that gap, if not all of that gap, by offering, a leg up. People tend to be quite open to that. What I would actually recommend is that such programs should offer additional help without changing the standards, because what hangs in the balance is trust in the institution. And if you have somebody who's been hired as your boss and you're not sure if they had, an easier job getting that than somebody else would have, then that undermines your trust in that person's capacity to lead or to execute their job. If it's, somebody gets into a university, maybe you don't trust the quality of their scholarship or their where that really matters, right? So you want to maintain the standard, and any such program should try to work to help people get over that set standard that everybody has to cross, because that maintains a level of public trust in the institution. But that said, I'm definitely open to the idea that to the degree that some real impediment can be identified, and discrimination is a real impediment, creating some bridge there is not necessarily inappropriate, but it has to be done rigorously, and it has to be done through the legitimate means, not by people storming into a president's office and demanding it, and then all of a sudden these changes are made at while somebody's kind of being held hostage, whether morally or physically. And so, no, I'm not against the whole idea, though.
Another critique that I think you get regularly is, are you just exaggerating this? This was something that Jordan Peterson also got, and Douglas Murray and other people who've been talking about similar issues. Some people will just sort of roll their eyes and say that this kind of talk of a hostile takeover of university campuses by these kind of Marxist components is just exaggerated. And if you actually go to a university, it often has a lot of different voices, and students themselves are not all agreeing with any of this stuff, and that it's kind of become a figment of a kind of conservative imagination. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so that's a good critique, and it does deserve elaboration, because there are two things that have to be said about it. One is that, as I've argued, and maybe you disagree with me, but I think that the parallel will suffice even if you disagree with my conclusion. I've argued that I think that this ideology operates very much like a religion, and maybe you disagree that it's a religion, and that's fine. But I want to draw the analogy to a religion, because when you have a religion, you sort of have the sort of theologically hardcore people who really know what they're doing and they're really into it. As I used to say, down from there, you have the pastors and the priests and so on who aren't quite the full-on theologians, but they are very well versed in it. They're very well grounded in that belief system. And as you come down further, you have the people who go to church all the time. And I used to have a friend who took notes at church. You have that guy who's like really into it. Then you have the guy who goes every week, but he doesn't really pay that much attention. And then you have the guy who they show up kind of sometimes when they can. And then the person who, I go on Easter and Christmas, but I don't really, I'm Christian. And so you have this whole kind of scale of intensity of belief. So when I describe what I'm describing, I tend to describe kind of the pure, unadulterated crystal meth version of critical race theory. Like when you read the books, when you listen to the actual scholars who are the all-out theologian level people in this ideology, this is what they say, and they say it over and over and over again.
So who are? Can I just give us a kind of top few names there? Who are the kind of high priests of this theology?
Well, in the popular sphere, the big names are going to be people like Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, Layla Saad, sort of. She's more pop level. Maybe Ta-Nehisi Coates would be another. He's kind of their poet laureate, I guess, more than a high priest, if you would.
So they're media, popular academics in the media generally.
Yeah, exactly. And then, there are other names, though, that are much more kind of high priest, and they hide in the academy much more. I mentioned Delgado and Stefanczyk, who wrote the book Critical Race Theory and Introduction. Kimberly Crenshaw is still alive. She's the architect of critical race theory and the originator of intersectionality. If we dip into other disciplines within this school of thought, Judith Butler is the queer theory queen. She's also got very much intersectional thought going on with what she does now. So there are these kind of high priests. Most of them are academics. Who understand the theology, the theory in a kind of clear, consistent way that your lay congregant has just kind of taken up some of. And so with that, you're going to go on a university campus and you're going to see a wide variety of opinions. You're going to find outright resistance and rejection of it as well when you talk to everyday folks. But the second thing that needs to be said is, where is this actually operating? And where this operates in a meaningful way, where you have to worry about if it's a genuine hostile takeover, is in administrative bureaucracies, which everywhere this ideology comes in, administrative bureaucracies flip very much, almost completely. Your HR department, your Office of Diversity and Inclusion, whether it's at your job, whether it's at a university, whether it's now in a city, Congress has one. The state of Washington in the U.S. has instated an equity task force that's dedicated to, it's supposed to last at least 50 years or something like this. And those things they're on the pure crystal meth version of the ideology. And the thing is they are administrative bureaucracies. So they set the community guidelines. They set the policies. They determine which trainings employees have to attend. They determine which courses students have to take. They determine the curricula in our schools. And so even if all you end up with is a bunch of kind of halfway there lay congregants out of this, you still mainstream the ideology. And the place where the actual decision making is taking place might be relatively small in terms of human resources numbers, but they are very ideologically concentrated and tolerate very little dissent. So if you understand this ideology as kind of like a Trojan horse full of bureaucrats, all of a sudden you can start to realize that the takeover can actually happen just at the administrative level. And of course, people are right to be skeptical, they're right to be cautious, they're right not to be alarmist about anything in general, but they should also remember just how small the bands of people, say, under Mao were, that were able to then take over all of a billion plus people in China and completely reset the culture. And you don't need a lot of people if you have the right amount of motivation, the right amount of the right kind of ideology, and the access to the right levers of power. And here it's our administrative bureaucracies. So with Trump getting it from the federal government, that's where he's taking it out of, is the administrative state that's built up within our federal bureaucracy.
So I guess there are two sort of pushback approaches here. One of them you just mentioned is, as Donald Trump said, it's the kind of wrecking ball approach, where you kind of politician who takes power and starts issuing decrees to kind of overturn this. We've got a kind of a much watered down version of it going on in the UK at the moment, where the Conservative government is threatening to put in two Conservative figures in charge of the BBC and a regulator called Ofcom, and everyone is going crazy about it. So that's the kind of institutional takeover through elected power pushback. I worry that one actually might just sort of entrench positions ultimately, because there are 22,000 people work at the BBC, and suddenly you've got a Conservative chairman, and they're just going to hate him or her.
Yes.
So I wonder whether there needs to be another approach, which is actually to delineate a different virtue, because actually most people just want to be good people and haven't thought deeply.
That's exactly right.
So
That's exactly right.
what thought have you got on how we could think about that second approach?
So yeah, what we're looking at basically is a top-down and a bottom-up approach simultaneously. And so I would actually argue that we are in a position. I normally would say that top-down approaches are just bad and we should avoid them as much as possible, but we're in a dire situation. Our administrative apparatuses have been taken over. Top-down cleanup of administrative apparatuses, but not of individuals' private consciences, is probably necessary. But what's really needed, because this could all flip with a single change, that you install a conservative leader of the BBC, they all get mad. The next guy comes in and sticks in, an uber progressive person. It could all get flipped over in a single decision. Top-down solutions like this are usually not lasting. What's needed, the critical theorists, and then following the critical theorists, Andrew Breitbart, were actually right that politics does follow culture. It's downstream from culture. And so we need a groundswell. And that's where I was mentioning earlier how important it is for us to start remembering the values that have made liberal societies what they are, that have made them work, that have minimized discrimination, that have minimized racism, have minimized sexism and misogyny, have opened equal opportunities for across the races, for men, for women, for all sexual orientations, and so on. We need to remember those principles. We've been able to be very complacent and very lazy, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, and not had to think much about defending liberalism. Fukuyama wrote The End of History at that point, saying that, well, liberalism is won. So for 30 years, nobody's had to think about what liberal principles are and why the people who framed them out in the first place in the late 18th century said that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. We stopped being vigilant. So we have to go back. And not only do we have to remember what those principles are and what liberalism does and why it does it the way that it does, which is to resolve conflicts in a particularly dispassionate way with minimal favoritism, we also have to understand that we need to update it for our new world. And I'm not pulling some new world order baloney. I mean that the world changed. The internet changes everything. The nature of our institutions all have to change around the facts of the internet and social media. Big legacy media, big academic institutions are in a new situation that makes things very difficult. In the United States, for example, we have a big problem with our universities having way too much administrative and physical infrastructure. So they're caught up in a money problem that creates other problems. But with the internet, these things maybe can be circumvented. So we have to update our liberal values. We have to get those core principles and understand what they are, what that conflict resolution or conflict management strategy looks like, why it matters that we treat people as individuals, why it matters that we defer to objective standards. And then we have to update those for the new social media era, where one wrong word on your Twitter account can result in you possibly getting yelled at by 1 million people in the next 3 days. We have to figure out how to deal with liberalism going forward. And that's an open question. Nobody knows the answer to this, but these are the things that we need to be developing. And we need to build a bottom-up groundswell of people who understand the value of individualism, of objective standards, of freedom, of liberty, of liberalism itself.
There's also,
and who are sensitive to the new paradigm in which it's being.
When you spoke about Twitter just there, it also made me think it's also to do with kindness, isn't it? If you talk about flipping the kind of moral high ground argument, actually to cancel someone for something they said stupidly on Twitter is not a kind thing to do.
No.
So there's a sense in which it's not just illiberal, it's actually unkind to be running such a kind of harsh world, and that in a way the pushback against some of this stuff is about returning to or discovering a new, gentler world where people don't need to kind of tiptoe around quite so much.
Kindness, forgiveness, a level of perspective to where we understand that A, everybody's not perfect all the time, B, things in the world change, so views that were considered acceptable in the 1990s may no longer be. So somebody who said something in the 1990s that would be deemed horrible today has no necessary bearing on their character as a person today, 25 or so years later. Maybe they've grown as well. So perspective of how things change, perspective of the fact that people have bad days or bad, like just things come out of their mouths or that or out of their fingertips on a keyboard that didn't come off right or they didn't mean things. I mean, there's a rule generally in I guess, publication that broadcasting would count to, that you want everything to be as self-contained as possible. You don't have to explain the story of the thing. But social media virtually guarantees that that won't happen, right? If you make your joke about a loved one and it's a little bit mean, and you make it on a comment thread on Facebook or something, and somebody screenshots that, now it's out of context and it's just horrible.
Who are the heroes that we should be looking for in this? I mean, we talked about how there needs to be a kind of cultural answer to this. And, you're writing a book that is doing very well, and that helps, I would say, give the kind of academic grounding and the kind of clear thinking to some of this. But it's, with the greatest respect, I don't think it's going to be a kind of enormous popular movement, that is going to kind of capture the hearts and minds of millions of 21-year-olds. I'm sure it will do extremely well.
No, it won't. Not on its own.
What does that?
For sure.
What does that person look like? Where are the leaders who can speak to this, to push back against some of this stuff without coming across as angry or reactionary or divisive?
No, there are kind of four things that have to be paid attention to, and so those are the realms where you want to look for your leaders. One is that what's actually happening with the ideology needs to be exposed. So people who are doing a responsible job of whistleblowing around it are at the moment leaders. It has to be explained. So hopefully people like myself who see themselves as explainers are able to clearly and fairly articulate what's going on, what the virtues and the vices of the different perspectives are. There's the need to articulate and provide alternatives. So people who are trying to speak clearly to that new vision that will be able to speak principally and get people roused on their values, whether that's connecting with one another, whether it's kindness and forgiveness, whether it's authenticity, whether it's, freedom and objectivity and all of these things that I've been talking about all along. And then there's also the builders, the people who are out trying to build the new institutions that match the new shape of the world, but are doing so in a principled way that fosters unity and progress rather than division and fighting.
You can kind of see, there have been sort of hints of it, haven't there? Almost like sort of precursors. You get it with kind of comedians who become extremely popular for saying kind of politically incorrect things. We also had this big furore over J.K. Rowling, literally the world's most popular author, who was pushing back on some of the kind of trans ideology and has really weathered that storm. And I'm sure she has lost a lot of fans and she's been attacked on social media, but largely the kind of establishment has stuck up for her. And even Barack Obama was kind of talking about woke in quite a sort of dismissive way. I wonder whether the kind of heroes will actually come from the kind of liberal establishment and they will sort of draw a line in the sand.
One hopes that there will be people within the liberal establishment that will kind of wake up to the woke thing and decide to start looking into those basic principles and drawing that line and standing up for those values and the value of those values, as opposed to the very kind of harsh world that you've described under woke values. So it's possible. There will also, of course, be new people rising up as well. What I would actually urge is that people, when we say liberal, first of all, that we understand liberal philosophically, but secondly, that we start to look to build coalitions across lines that for the past 30 years have been unfashionable to build coalitions across. People on the left and people on the right, liberals and conservatives, or progressives and conservatives, can meet one another. And if they share the overarching values of society, they're allies. Atheists and Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and you name it across the different religions. You don't have to fight one religion to another or lack of religion to having religion. You can actually ally with one another. So the old battle lines have to stop making sense, and the new battle lines have to be drawn about, do we care about the fundamental principles of liberal societies that move them forward, or do we want to move into something like a new kind of feudalism that's based on whether it's identity or whatever it happens to be. It looks like it'll be based on identity, which is one of the crudest possible bases. And new alliances so we don't have to just look to the liberal establishment. We need to be looking to who are the voices on the conservative side, for example, who are willing to set aside some of their core conservative goals in order to pursue something bigger? Who are the Christians who are willing to talk to the Muslims, who are willing to talk to the atheists in defense of the ability to have a secular society that defends and protects faith as well as preserving people from having to take it up? Those are the people we should all be trying to ally together with.
Which kind of brings us neatly back to where we started, which is the current election. President Trump, who was almost quoting your book in that speech last week, is not the character that really matches what you have described. Is not someone who kind of embodies those liberal values of respecting institutions and process and all of the rest of it. He's a sort of street fighter by kind of personality. We're in this incredibly divisive election. Each side thinks it's kind of life or death that they're fighting. What good can possibly come out of this election? Like, how do you see the argument you're talking about playing out over the next 6 weeks and beyond?
I don't see a lot of good coming out of this election in the short term. The most brilliant thing that I've heard on the issue of this election is that obviously everything you just said about Donald Trump is true. It is correct. He is definitely not the champion of liberalism that we would hope for. But that said, it appears that we have a choice between what does the world look like in a year versus 10 years. And from what the most brilliant thing that I've heard is that the vote for Joe Biden in the coming election makes things better 1 year from now and worse 10 years from now. And to vote for Donald Trump makes things much worse 1 year from now and much better 10 years from now. And it's not by any virtue of Trump. It's by virtue of the fact that being a street fighter, he stands against a mess that buys us another 4 years. Another way that I heard it phrased is slow drip poison versus fast drip poison, or fast acting poison. And which one do you take? Well, if you take the slow poison, which is Trump, maybe you have a few years to figure it out. And if you take the fast one, you just die. And so find an antidote, I should say, as far as figuring it out goes. No, but Donald Trump represents a significant number of problems that are in line with this whole mess that we're in right now, this anti-liberal or counter-enlightenment mess that we're in right now. And he certainly inflames the world by being positioned that way. The thing is, though, is he's the only candidate that has come along in quite a while, 30 or 40 years, who seems clearly willing to stand up to the administrative bureaucracy with this move on critical race theory. So that's a significant thing, because administrative bureaucracy is where this thing takes over. This is where the parasite attaches, if you want to put it in kind of a coarse metaphor. So I don't see that Joe Biden is going to discourage the growth of the administrative bureaucracy in its woke manifestations. So I think we have two very bad choices, one of which may be slightly less bad.
Now, I don't want to leave our viewers with too depressing a thought, but this may be. What do you think what do you think the sort of the bad outcome is then? I guess I have to ask, let's fast forward that 10 years. Let's presume that the politics, the leader we're talking about doesn't emerge, the cultural trajectory continues. Where do you think that ends up?
I keep telling some of my colleagues that I feel like we're in the Lord of the Rings, where they say the quest is on the edge of a knife, fear but a little to either side, and all is lost. I feel very much like we're in that situation right now, societally.
So you think the Western civilization hangs in the balance?
I do, yeah. Or at least the Western civilization as we have known it. And the ideology that wants to take over the administrative bureaucracy is totalitarian in nature. So we're in a threat between a possibility of an authoritarian versus a virtual guarantee of a totalitarian situation in which we have severe limitations on our thoughts, expression, and belief. The 10-year ugly picture would look very much like China with their social credit and their surveillance and their kind of quasi-communist or half-communist approach to economics, I think. That's where an installation of this goes, except that it would be deeply linked with race politics. The ideal situation, if we want to end on a happy note, is that it is possible that we buy time in some way or another and do find the groundswell to create the movement that creates the liberal renewer, if you will, the politician that brings back liberal values for the 21st century. That's an absolute possibility. The window is not closed. So we should work to make that movement.
We'll hold on to that, I think, that you've given us the positive thought we hope for. Thank you, James Lindsay. That was James Lindsay, co-author of a new book called Cynical Theories, which is out now, detailing the history of critical theory in all of its complex manifestations. A fascinating read, and thanks to him. This was Lockdown TV from Unheard. Hope you enjoyed it.